So remote patient monitoring is an area that has always held tremendous promise. But as I look across the landscape and as I talk to people, it's not living up to its potential. And I think everybody is beginning to realize it and is beginning to wonder what's going on and what we can do about it. So that's what we're going to talk about on this video. Hi, welcome back to the channel, everybody. Hope everybody is doing well, is happy and healthy. And so as I said, we're going to talk about remote patient monitoring in this video. What's happening, what's wrong, quite frankly, and how we can fix it going forward. As to give you a little bit of a roadmap for this video, we're going to start by looking at first principle. So what should RPM be? What should RPM do? What are some good use cases? What's a good definition? Next, we're going to look at how we know that there is a problem. Thereafter, we're going to sort of take a look at it from 2 points of view. What are the challenges with RPM from the point of view of the healthcare delivery system, whether it's hospitals or physicians, as well as what are some of the challenges in terms of creating RPM solutions that startups and companies in healthcare in general who are looking to put them together face. Then we're going to talk about where do we go from here? How can we solve these problems and these challenges? And then we're going to wrap it up. And so with that, a couple of quick caveats. I have no interest in any RPM companies. I have no conflicts of interest or anything like that. I'm not being paid for putting together this video. I'm doing this out of the goodness of my heart, so you're welcome. I am not offering any specific advice to anyone, so whether you're an investor or the executive in one of these companies or a healthcare system, all I'm doing is sort of giving you my perspectives and my thoughts as opposed to specific business advice. And finally, I'm a huge fan of remote patient monitoring and a huge believer in the potential. But I'm also, quite frankly, very frustrated and very saddened about the current state of affairs, especially keeping in mind how much tremendous need there is out there, the potential, and the fact that we're not meeting up to it. So with that, let's dive in. So starting at the beginning, what is the purpose of remote patient monitoring? Well, to my thinking, and starting with what I would call first principles, I guess the good thing is that most people don't spend much time in hospitals or in physicians' offices. And because of that, a tremendous amount of data about our bodies is lost and is never captured and can therefore never be used to diagnose us and improve our care. And that's a real loss because that data could potentially be very valuable. And so from that perspective, when I think about it, the purpose of RPM first and foremost is to capture relevant data that we can then use to generate actionable insights. And actionable insights is one of these key words that I think pops up in terms of digital care and remote patient monitoring, and I think it's a truly relevant one. Now, as far as I'm concerned, that directly leads to specific use cases, and I think there are 3 plus 1 use cases. 3 in healthcare and 1 in clinical trials that we're going to talk about. And so the 3 in healthcare delivery, starting with the most obvious one, is of course the management of chronic conditions, whether it's asthma, COPD, high blood pressure, or any number of other conditions. There could clearly be tremendous value in understanding better what happens to people who have them based on various, data points. Next is sort of post-acute, post-procedural surgical care. Once people are released from the hospital, once people have undergone a procedure and gone back home, there could certainly be tremendous value in capturing specific pieces of data about how they're faring and what they're doing. For instance, if you had a knee replacement surgery, are you actually moving around or not? Because if you don't, then we know that your knee replacement surgery is not going to be as successful as it could have been. The third case is diagnosis of conditions that are not frequent enough so they can be diagnosed in a hospital or a physician office setting without someone having to live there. And so that can better be diagnosed by people being back home, but carrying a monitor with them that will capture it in the course of several days. And so those are, I think, the main use cases for remote patient monitoring for healthcare delivery. The clinical trials one is, fairly obvious in many ways, I think, because people who are participating in clinical trials, it would be very useful to collect more data about their vital signs and what they're doing and what is happening to them. And I believe that that would enable us to have shorter clinical trials with fewer participants because we would be getting more data from each and every one of them. And that in turn could reduce the cost of clinical trials as well as their duration and ultimately lead to drugs being available sooner. And so based on this, I think it sort of follows that a comprehensive remote patient monitoring solution needs to be comprised of a number of specific components, starting with the sensor or sensors. That might be something as simple as a scale or a blood pressure cuff, or maybe something more sophisticated like a nebulizer or a spirometer, or any number of other sensors that are collecting the data from patients. Next, therefore, we need to have somewhere to put the data, and more often than not, that's going to be a cloud-based database. Thereafter, we obviously need to do something with the data. We've talked about the purpose and the need to generate actionable insights, so we need analytics that can do analysis of the data. We then need to make that data and the analysis available to both patients and caregivers. And so that calls for an app or apps. And finally, we need to have integration to electronic medical systems for hospital systems and physicians to be able to use them and to integrate the data into electronic medical records. And so those are the pieces, and we will talk about different elements of that as we continue. So we've said that there is a problem with RPM, and so now we're going to dive into it and talk about what the problem is and how we know that there is a problem. And so for starters, we know that hospital systems are finding it difficult to deploy RPM solutions to patients' homes. And in many ways, it's actually very telling that Best Buy and their president for healthcare, Deb DiSanzo, have based their healthcare strategy, at least in part, on using the Geek Squad to help to implement and install and fix problems with RPM in patients' homes. And unfortunately, it's an accurate observation that there is a problem and a challenge here, but it's also, of course, a tremendous red flag. How come that we've developed solutions that are so difficult to deploy that we now need the Geek Squad to help to get it out to patients' home and make it work and fix it when it breaks down? RPM shouldn't be that complicated, and deploying it shouldn't be that complicated. It should be simple. So, huge red flag and a huge problem right there. Second issue is VCs. VCs have poured a lot of money into startups, and they're now pulling back. Many of them have clearly concluded that the RPM space is too crowded, that they don't want to put more money into it. And it's both a sign that things aren't great, but it also something that has consequences, because now RPM startups are struggling to raise money to continue to exist and to scale and to grow. and we will clearly see a shakeout, and we'll talk about it in just a minute. And finally, we know from the side of patients, especially people who are elderly, people who are sick, people who may not have access to Wi-Fi and may not have smartphones, that RPM is difficult for them to have and use. And so overall, multiple signs of trouble and a good indication, quite frankly, of the things that we need to fix going forward. And so in terms of problems and challenges, what does it look like from the point of view of the healthcare delivery systems and hospitals? And I think there are two fundamental challenges here that it's worthwhile for us to talk about. The first one is that change is obviously difficult. RPM entails potentially significant changes in how physicians and healthcare systems take care of and care for patients. And so that requires changes in processes, changes in workflow, integrations to happen, people to be trained. And that's, of course, never simple. And now it's made more difficult by the fact that we know that hospital systems are struggling when it comes to staff. They lost a tremendous number of people during COVID. They have not come back. And now they're both trying to deliver care and change their processes so they can start using RPM better to hopefully make them more efficient without having the staff to do that. It's sort of, to use an old cliche, you're trying to rebuild the airplane while you're flying it. It doesn't really work very well. Next is a problem that is, quite frankly, very paradoxical when it comes to healthcare, because clearly healthcare deals with very, very specific diseases for specific patients, and that's how we look at patients, that's how we treat patients. But at the same time, when it comes to remote patient monitoring, which of course has to be very disease-specific, indication-specific, because we need to capture the right data and do the right analysis, hospital systems are not capable of dealing with a multitude of vendors, one for each specific disease or indication. It just doesn't work for them. There are only so many electronic medical record integrations that you can do. There are only so many bills that they can handle. There is only so many solutions in which they can train their staff. And so the fact that most RPM solutions are disease specific and cover one disease and one disease only is a real problem in terms of the interface between healthcare systems and disease management companies. And we're going to talk about solutions in a second. So in addition to the problems that hospitals face because of who they are and what they do, there are also a number of challenges that are, quite frankly, brought about by the RPM tools and solutions that we need to be mindful of and, quite frankly, need to fix. The first one goes back to one of the issues that we've already talked about, and that is, what is the use case and who's the intended user? Is any particular solution intended for the physicians, for the patients, for the healthcare system, and what problem exactly is it looking to solve? And does it actually generate actionable insights? And I think one area where that has actually worked very well is diabetes and blood glucose monitoring, because it's so very clear what needs to be done and who the end user is. And here there is no doubt that the end user is the patient, the person who has high glucose levels, who needs to monitor them, who needs to know what they are because they're going to do something about it, is the end user. And it's also very clear what needs to happen here. And so there are solutions that are out there and that work very well. But I don't know that we can say that for the majority of remote patient monitoring solutions, because they're not this clear, they're not this concise, and they're not this effective, quite frankly. Next is the challenge that many RPM solutions are created with standard components. They use AWS or Google Cloud or Azure, which is wonderful because it makes it cheaper, but they also use standard components. So they use the IoT connected blood pressure cuffs or scales or whatnot, which is great. But once again, it's hard to see how you can create a solution that creates unique value and has a competitive advantage if all you do is that you bring together a bunch of standard components. There's just nothing unique about that solution, and anyone can replicate it. And I think people have, and that's one of the reasons that we have too many RPM solutions out there, many of which are not unique and don't add enough value. And so one significant challenge with RPM that RPM solutions face is that there is actually a limited number of sort of established standard sensors out there that can be used. We're talking about scales, blood pressure cuffs, nebulizers, and things like that. But I actually think that if we're going to expand RPM further and make it more useful, we need to develop and create new sensors to capture data that we're currently not capturing. And I think this is an area where RPM companies could make great progress and could differentiate themselves. But of course, one of the challenges here is that requires a different skill set than many of the RPM companies that we have today actually have. So they need to transform themselves to actually be able to create more value. Next problem, which is actually a very major issue that isn't talked about too much, is that how do we know that the data is valid? How do we know that the data collected by these remote tools is actually valid? And yes, many of them have undergone trials and gotten FDA's blessing, which is why they're in the market or being reimbursed. But there are two things that can happen after something gets approved and shipped. One is that devices don't remain calibrated forever. And where have you, quite frankly, seen RPM devices getting tested and recalibrated? And the second is, how do we know that the users use them correctly? Because if they don't, then we know that the data probably isn't correct either. And so I think there is a tremendous amount of work that needs to be done here that has quite frankly been neglected in making sure that the data that is reported back by the sensors that is analyzed as part of RPM solutions is actually clinically valid data. And there are ways of doing it. AI can do that because valid data has very specific signatures that can be detected and separated from invalid data. But it's something that hasn't yet been incorporated in many RPM solutions and quite frankly needs to be for patients and clinicians to have confidence in them and to use them and to follow their advice. Finally, just getting back to something that we've alluded to before, many of those solutions are just too difficult to install, too difficult to use. Bluetooth and Wi-Fi are wonderful, but they're both plagued with problems, starting with the fact that they both drop on a regular basis. And it's not easy for everybody to figure out how to reconnect it. And the other part, of course, is that not everybody has access to Wi-Fi. Not everybody has access to a smartphone, which is Bluetooth. And so for that reason, many of these solutions are simply not available to people who need them because they're so reliant on either Wi-Fi or Bluetooth, which some of these people don't have. So that's a serious problem that we need to fix. So we've talked a lot about problems, so where does that leave us? Well, a couple of thoughts. We've already mentioned that there are too many RPM solutions, that many of them are not necessarily unique or competitive, and that the VCs have come to recognize that this space is too crowded and that they're not willing to put money into it anymore, or at least not as much as would be needed to support all the existing companies. So that tells me that some of the RPM companies that are out there are going to fold, and others are going to be acquired and consolidated into other companies. And that's probably not a bad thing, because that is how we hopefully get to a better solution set of fewer but better RPM solutions. But in addition to that, I think the path to the next generation of RPM solutions lies in us addressing a couple of issues in very, very specific ways. And so first, I think we've already talked about the need to have well-defined solutions that address specific needs for specific patient groups and for clinicians. And here I think RPM solutions need to focus much more on the patient and the clinician journeys, to understand it better and to define solutions that are closely linked to those journeys. And one of the big elements I think of that is going to be developing sensors to capture data that we're currently not capturing, because that is going to open up the path to new insights, new actionable insights, which, as we've said, are very, very important and, in fact, essential to RPM. Finally, well, actually not finally, because there are two more points. Next, we need to have RPM solutions that are easier to use. So not only Bluetooth, not only Wi-Fi connectivity, we need to make them more universally connectable. And finally, I think from the point of view of hospitals, what we need to have are RPM platforms, which cover multiple diseases, multiple indications in a single platform. And that's where I think that the consolidation can actually be helpful. If it can help to bring together companies that currently are very single disease, single indication, into consolidated companies that have a single underlying platform. So you only have one connection to the ERP system at a hospital, one bill. You only need to train your staff on one solution, but that are configured to help in multiple disease areas, multiple indications. I think that would be both essential and make implementation of RPM at the hospital level much easier. So to wrap it up quickly, RPM is still unfulfilled promise. It has tremendous potential, but we're not there yet. Short term, it's pretty clear to me that we're going to see a bit of a shakeup. Companies are going to fold, companies are going to be consolidated, and that's just the way it is, because of the much tighter funding environment right now, that money isn't free anymore. Longer term, what I hope we're going to end up with is better RPM solutions that are based on the patient journey, that have developed new sensors that help us collect new data and generate new, unique, actionable insights that are going to be of benefit to both patients and clinicians. So there you have it. And now I want to hear from you. What's your experience with RPM? What would you like to see happen? What do you think is important that we haven't talked about? Let us know so we can collectively contribute to developing better solutions. And be well. We'll see you soon. Take good care. Bye-bye.